Welcome back. Let's start this post with a story another clinician shared with me long ago. This clinician lived in a small rural town, one of those towns where everyone seems to know each other. And she shared with me that one day, one of her elderly patients came in for her annual checkup. The clinician remembered hearing a few months before that this woman's husband had died. She said to her patient, "I'm so sorry to hear that your husband has recently passed away." The clinician then described that she saw a very unexpected look on this woman's face, on her patient's face. And this led the clinician to gently say to her, "Maybe I'm not so sorry." The elderly woman, her patient, then shared with the clinician in detail that on their honeymoon night, her honeymoon night with this husband who had recently passed away, her husband opened a drawer, showed her a gun in the drawer, and said to her, "If you don't do all that I say, if you don't do all that I tell you to do, I will use this gun on you." Can you even imagine? This woman lived with this threat, with this fear and intimidation for the 50 plus years that she was married. Today, we'll be examining the abuse behavior, fear, and intimidation. And I welcome you back to Truth and Heart Unfiltered with Pam Glenn. As many of you know, I'm a certified nurse midwife, sharing information about relationship abuse as well as the individual abuse behaviors, one post at a time. Because this topic, the abuse behavior, fear, and intimidation, involves so much more content, I've decided to use my laptop today because I want to be sure that I do not miss sharing any important points with you. Now, I wonder if you've noticed something about my previous post, which, as you know, have defined and explained individual abuse behaviors. Let's take a moment and think about this. We've discussed isolation, rushing the relationship, which includes love bombing, controlling a partner's identity, possessiveness, degrading, jealousy with no basis for it. Here's the question I have for you as we look back on all these individual abuse behaviors. Have any of these abuse behaviors involved any type of physical abuse or violence? The answer is no, not one. And I have more abuse behaviors still to define for you. And in most cases, they also do not involve physical abuse. However, the abuse behavior we're going to look at today, fear and intimidation, is where we might see physical abuse start to creep in. More on that in just a moment. I think at this point, it's important to re-emphasize again that emotional abuse is abuse, even when there is no physical abuse or violence happening. Emotional abuse in and of itself is often so extremely destructive and damaging to a person's life. And as I've shared previously, victims of abuse have often said something like this: "The broken bones will heal, the bruises will heal, but it's the scars on my heart from the emotional abuse that I've endured from my abusive partner that are so tough to heal." So let's now jump in and examine today's abuse behavior, fear, and intimidation. And by the way, as I often say, if the content is triggering for anyone, please turn off the video, and most importantly, please take care of yourself. Now, fear and intimidation may play out in many different ways. Here's a few examples. The abuser may use an intimidating look, or have an intimidating behavior, or simply use a tone of voice in a very threatening way to get what they want. What do abusers want? They want to have power and control over their partner. Here's some other ways that fear and intimidation may play out. The abuser may threaten their partner. They may break their partner's treasured items. The abuser may also display a weapon or use it in a threatening way toward their partner. Now, here's where physical abuse may creep in. The abuser may actually use a weapon in an act of physical violence toward their partner. Again, this is where physical abuse creeps in. In addition, the abuser may threaten to hurt a pet and may actually harm the pet. This is also where the abuser may threaten to harm the children as well. and maybe even begin to abuse them. Furthermore, with fear and intimidation, the abuser may say something like this to their partner: "If I can't have you, then no one can." And along with this statement is the threat to murder their partner. When a weapon is involved in an abusive relationship, for example, used in a threatening way towards their partner, there is a significantly increased risk of the partner getting murdered by their abuser or by an ex who was abusive. My next post is going to cover what's called femicide, the murder of women, as well as the murder risk for all abuse victims in much more detail, so more to come on that. Now, here's a story that captures the various aspects of this abuse behavior, fear, and intimidation. I had a pregnant patient come into my clinic long ago. She was early in her pregnancy and she had just moved to the area with her boyfriend. She knew nobody in this new location, this new state, very far from home. She was isolated from her family, her friends, and her support system. At each prenatal visit, she started to share with me more and more about the emotional abuse that was happening at home by her boyfriend towards her. Also, with each prenatal visit, the emotional abuse was getting more intense and more frequent in the examples that she shared with me. We call this the cycle of abuse, the pattern we often see when abuse becomes more frequent and more severe with time. So, this patient and I explored options for her safety at each prenatal visit. I continued to emphasize my serious concerns for her safety, especially with the escalating violence. Then there was a day, late in her pregnancy, 1 month before her due date, that she shared with me that her boyfriend had just bought a gun and used it toward her in a very threatening way the night before. This was the day that I now knew her risk of getting murdered by him had now just gone sky high, hearing that he not only had a weapon, but he used it toward her in a threatening way. I shared this specific concern with her in very great detail, that her risk of getting murdered by her boyfriend had now gone very high. I did all that I could to connect her to the resources in the community. And eventually she did return to her home state, to her family, and to her support system. Now let me share one more aspect of this risk of getting murdered by an abusive partner. There was a small study done quite a while back, and it looked at 30 women who almost got murdered by their abusive partners or their abusive ex-partners, but they survived the attempt. So they studied these 30 women, and again, it's a small study. About half, 50%, 14 out of the 30 women had no idea that they were at risk of what again is called femicide, the murder of women. They had no idea the risk of getting murdered by their abusers or their exes who were abusive. They were in total denial of this risk of getting murdered by their partner. So to summarize, it's so important that people in abusive relationships are aware of this risk of murder. This is also why I've included the hotline number in the written part of my posts. And as I've often explained, advocates are available via this hotline number 24/7 for anyone who might need this assistance. And if anyone is in danger, please call 911 immediately. Now, on the flip side, in healthy relationships, fear and intimidation is not a strategy used by either partner towards each other. Rather, in healthy relationships, each partner communicates openly about their needs. And it goes without saying that both partners feel safe to communicate their needs to each other. There's a sincere and respectful desire to understand each other about each other's needs. There's collaboration, there's compromise, and again, there's this genuine, sincere, and overall support for each other. Thank you for hanging in there with this rather intense post on fear and intimidation. I wonder, what are your feelings after hearing this information? What are your perspectives about fear and intimidation? Have you had any experiences with this with a present partner or previous partner? Have you had any aha moments about this? And if so, it would be great to hear your thoughts in the comments section of this post. And if you do decide to write a comment, please be sure to not use any names or identifiers. My next post is again going to focus on femicide, the murder of women, as well as the risk of murder for all abuse victims. Have you shared this YouTube post with other people? If so, I do want to be sure to thank you, because you never know how this information may help somebody else in a significant and positive way. And if you haven't yet done so, I encourage you to consider sending this out to those you know. So thanks again for your time today. I look forward to seeing you at the next post. Take care.